Hey everyone, this is writing micro lesson number 7 on effectively utilizing evidence for Honors 112 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine. And I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So today we're going to talk about effectively utilizing evidence in your writing, and that raises the question, what is evidence? So this is a really important skill. Probably all of you, as you've been writing, have been utilizing some form of evidence in your writing in the course of making an argument. Even in class, as we're raising certain points, you're utilizing evidence. And the goal here is really to be systematic in how we think about evidence and how we think about the necessity of evidence in making any sort of claim. So evidence simply refers to information used in writing to support or lend justification to justify a statement or assertion. So that could be a lot of different things. In the Honors College, because of the nature of the course, a lot of that is going to be textual evidence drawn from primary sources. But that could be statistical data. It could be the results of empirical analysis. It could be expert opinion. When you think of evidence, you have to think kind of expansively, and you also have to know the context in which you're writing, so you know what is the appropriate form of evidence. And ultimately, how strong, how persuasive your arguments are will rest upon the strength of that evidence. So it's important to be mindful of thinking intentionally about backing up the statements that you're making and thinking about what the appropriate evidence is for the context in which you're writing. So some practical guidance on integrating evidence into your writing. At the starting point, as I said, there are many different types of evidence. So evidence could be historical facts. You could be making some sort of claim about change in something, change in family structure, change in societal trends over time. And in order to do that, you're going to be making reference to some period in history and comparing it to the contemporary period. So a historical fact would be an example of evidence that you could include in your writing. It could also be statistics or empirical evidence. Maybe you're talking about how many individuals are connected via social media. You'd have some empirical evidence, some numbers to back that up. It could be textual evidence, which, as I said, is what we rely on pretty heavily in our writing in the Civilization sequence. So you're drawing in quotes from a text. You're analyzing trends in an argument that's made within something that we're reading. Many of the texts that we encounter in honors have been analyzed and discussed and studied by others. And so in any of the texts that we're going to read in this class, there's going to be what we call a secondary literature. And for these texts, it's usually going to be pretty rich. So it could be the case that you're writing about, Dante's Inferno or Machiavelli's The Prince or the Aeneid, and you're drawing in evidence, claims that were made from some secondary source. That is a perfectly appropriate form of evidence. It could be an anecdote or personal experience. That constitutes a form of evidence. You don't want to rely completely upon that, because oftentimes individual experiences or anecdotes are not what we call generalizable, right? We can't make broad generalizations about all of American society or all of humanity on their basis, but they can be helpful, and it can be a powerful way to kind of capture the attention of your reader. And then lastly, expert opinion. So if there's someone that is an established, reputable source in a certain area, if somebody has a PhD in Italian literature and they've written extensively on Dante's Inferno, and you want to include some observation or statement that they've made, their expertise lends weight to their statements about a certain text or a certain trend in history, and so you can rely upon expert opinion. So evidence can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes we even just use the word data, and data, I say this a lot in my political science classes, data doesn't just have to be numbers. There's all sorts of different forms of data. But think broadly and expansively about the evidence that you can include to support an argument, and also recognize the context in which you're writing and what would be appropriate for that context. So some considerations in choosing evidence. One, you want to think about, is the evidence relevant to the argument laid out in your thesis statement and or the main idea of your paragraph, right? So sometimes I'll encounter evidence that feels as if it's just slipped in so that there's some sort of reference to the text. And that's okay, but it's not really an effective strategy of writing. If you're trying to persuade someone of something and you just drop in a quote that's only tangentially related to the argument they're making in the paragraph or the larger argument of the paper, then that's not really helpful. And it seems strange to the reader. It seems weird and out of place and perhaps unrelated. So you want to think very intentionally about, where is the proper place to include evidence and what is the right evidence to include to back up an argument or a statement. This is also an area in which having a clear thesis statement is going to be really important. I know I've said that at numerous points, but if you don't have a clear thesis statement at the outset, the job you have of trying to choose persuasive, compelling evidence is going to be a lot harder. You also want to think about, is the evidence credible? So a couple of things to consider here. One, is it clear, right? So from a point of view of credibility, in order for something to be credible, we first have to understand it. And sometimes you'll find something that is making a point or is potentially supporting your argument. But if you just pull out a section and include it as a direct quote or try to paraphrase it, it might not be clear specifically how it relates. So you want to emphasize clarity and try to choose evidence it's going to be immediately clear for the reader how that relates to the larger argument that you're making. It should also be informative. So the kind of litmus test for choosing a piece of evidence is, does it enrich the argument that you're making? Is it adding some new information or some new data point, some new piece of human knowledge that is going to actually enrich what you're writing? Does it inform and widen the scope of what your reader is going to understand? And if it doesn't, then you have to think about whether or not it's worthy of inclusion. And then lastly, reputation. This goes back to the source, right? So in general, you want to try to think about reputability of sources. Random things that you find on personal web pages on the internet might not be the most credible source. Wikipedia is, I think, a great starting point for trying to understand a complex issue, but it shouldn't be the type of thing that you're citing in an academic paper. The great thing about Wikipedia is that they cite their sources, and oftentimes those sources are reputable journals, reports that have been done, other pieces of secondary literature. And so Wikipedia can be your starting point for trying to understand something that's relatively new to you, and I use it all the time. But it shouldn't be the final place, right? You should try to utilize evidence that goes beyond that. In general, journalistic sources, you want reputable, objective journalistic sources, well-known publications. If you're drawing in evidence from, a quote-unquote expert, you want to ensure that person actually has background and credentials to offer some sort of statement or interpretation of an issue or a question. If you're drawing in from some sort of report or there's some sort of empirical research, you want to ensure that it's appeared in some sort of reputable outlet, or it's the person producing it or the institution or organization producing it is credible and has a good reputation. So you do want to think beyond simply, I found it on the internet, therefore it's true. Okay, there's lots of stuff on the internet, and a lot of it is total bunk. So you want to think about, the reputability of your source as well. But if you have something that's clear, if you have something that adds new understanding and new depth to the argument that you're making and comes from a reputable source, then that's probably a good piece of evidence to include. So here are your criteria for choosing evidence. You always want to frame the evidence in relation to your thesis statement. It should be clear to your reader how the evidence that you are including in your writing connects to that overarching claim or argument. They shouldn't have to, search or struggle to make those connections. And the way to test that is to ask yourself that question. So as you're proofreading your work, you want to make sure that, okay, it's clear that this evidence is connected in some way to my larger argument. You also want to contextualize and introduce the evidence for your reader. So anytime you introduce, a claim, some sort of quotation from a text, it's going to it's an interjection. It's going to kind of insert itself into the paper. And so you want to try to guide your reader as much as possible through that evidence that you're integrating. If it's a direct quote, the change in voice can be weird, right? If you're writing in your own narrative voice and then all of a sudden you're integrating a direct quote from a newspaper article or a journal article, that can be it can be a jarring transition. So you want to use transitional language, and you want to set up a paragraph in which you're going to include evidence in such a way that you take your reader through the steps to get to that claim. Right? Lead them up to that claim, and then after you've introduced it, provide some contextualization of your own to help them understand it. It's also important to realize that you can paraphrase or summarize as necessary. So if you find an article that has some really good piece of evidence, some stat or statistic that's going to help make your argument, or you find a piece of secondary literature writing about your topic or your text that you're analyzing, but it's worded in a way that's really confusing, or you have a very, very long sentence that you can condense down and convey that same information, then you should do that. You shouldn't hesitate to paraphrase things. You'll still want to cite them if it's outside information, so there should still be a citation, but you don't have to directly quote everything that you're integrating from outside sources. So feel free to paraphrase, feel free to summarize, feel free to take a quote and kind of chop out the section that's useful for your argument, and don't feel as if you have to present necessarily the whole sentence or the whole paragraph. So decide what the most essential element is to support your point, and be discriminating in what evidence you choose to include. So here is an example of a sentence that I think effectively utilizes outside evidence to make its point. And I chose it very intentionally. I find a lot of times in papers that students are writing that there are claims made about some change that has happened over time that are not adequately supported in evidence, right? So we have all these notions of how the world is today and how the world used to be. And I think a lot of them are just projections. I think a lot of times when we say, in present times, X, Y, or Z happens, but back in the olden days, that didn't happen. We can be overgeneralizing, or we can just be saying things that are outright inaccurate. And so in general, when you make those sorts of claims, you want to support them in evidence. So this is an example. I'll just read it for you quickly. It's talking about Americans and our selfishness, essentially, the fact that we're too wrapped up in ourselves, and making an argument about how that has become more of a problem over time. So the author says, today, Americans are too self-centered. Even our families don't matter as much anymore as they once did. Other people and activities take precedence. In fact, the evidence shows that most American families no longer eat together, preferring instead to eat on the go while rushing to the next appointment. Sit-down meals are time to share and connect with others. However, that connection has become less valued as families begin to prize individual activities over shared time, promoting self-centeredness over group identity. I think that's a really good paragraph, right? Because it's making a general observation that I think everyone has probably seen to some extent the ways in which we're wrapped up in ourselves, and perhaps you've been out to dinner with others and everybody's on their phone, or you're at home with your family and everybody's kind of lost in their own little world. But this actually backs it up with some research from an outside source and cites it appropriately. They don't integrate some direct quote, so they're able to keep this in their own voice, but they do provide a citation so that if the reader was interested, they could go find it. And they also lead the reader up to the evidence really well, right? So they're making a general claim about how Americans are self-centered. They elaborate a little bit more. They provide a piece of evidence that supports that argument, and then they provide some follow-up in which they say, they elaborate upon and provide context for the fact that people are eating together less. And so they're emphasizing why sit-down meals are important. And when we sit down less often to eat with one another, that has a larger implication. So I actually drew this from a source that you see there that you can go to if you're interested. It's really about how to effectively use evidence. But I think that's a good example, right? This is something to kind of aspire to. Now, you might not be writing about people sitting down to eat with their families, but just in general, the structure, I think, is good to think about for how to include evidence. All right, so I have some additional sources here on utilizing evidence. One is the Purdue Online Writing Lab, which has a resource dedicated specifically to how to utilize evidence effectively. Also, the Lynchburg College Writing Center has a guide on utilizing evidence from their online writing lab. For your assignment for this week, I want you to be intentional in how you utilize your evidence, and you are going to guide yourself in terms of how to think about how to include evidence. Guide yourself in relation to this. These are your criteria. This is what I'll be focusing on. So you want to frame this in relation to your thesis statement. You want to contextualize and introduce the evidence, and feel free to paraphrase and summarize as necessary. And if you do all that, I think you'll find that your evidence has more of an impact on the reader. It resonates with the reader better, and it actually makes for a more persuasive argument. So we will wrap up there, and I look forward to reading what you write this week. Thanks very much.